Good afternoon, Dan.
This is the second week in a row we're doing this in the afternoon. Are we starting a bad habit?
You keep traveling.
Yes, it's my fault. Of course it is. All right, well, what are we talking about today?
Inheritances, lifestyle creep, and leadership.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it.
Well, these are almost entirely unrelated things. I guess maybe I can see an inheritance and lifestyle creep together, but leadership's a little bit out in left field. So, okay, hit me. What are we talking about first?
Well, we're starting with inheritances, or some of it could kind of apply to other lump sum type events, like, you win the lottery, you win a lawsuit, whatever. Something like that. You're getting a big chunk of money all at once that you maybe were or were not anticipating. First of all, I want to talk about when you can count on something like that. Because sometimes we'll talk to people and they're like, oh, I know when my mom passes one day, I'm going to get this inheritance. So, I'm set. I don't have to worry.
So, in most cases, you really can't depend on it at all. And we can talk about the clear exceptions to that. But just generally speaking, when somebody says, "Oh, I'm going to inherit stuff from my parents," like, look, in most cases, there's nothing that's going to stop your parents from disowning you or leaving a disproportionate amount to somebody else or otherwise putting some strings and attachments on it that make it difficult or almost impossible to obtain. And so, from a planning standpoint, when we have a client, let's say, and they say, "Oh, my parents are going to leave me money, and I'm thinking one of them might pass away soon, or my grandparent, whoever it is," we're like, well, that's terrific. And when that happens one day, we will build that into your plan. But until it literally happens and you literally have read the will or the trust or whatever it is and know exactly what you're getting, we are going to assume that none of that happens. And we need to build a plan that survives without it.
Okay. All right. Well, what are those specific situations then that you want to call out?
So, in certain cases, particularly around estate planning and kind of advanced estate planning, there can be irrevocable trusts or various gifting strategies that essentially either start front loading your inheritance, where like your parents are just giving you money, or putting money in some sort of vehicle that allows you to receive it before they pass, or makes it so that when they pass it must go to you. And that doesn't mean then that that money couldn't be lost in a bad investment or mismanaged or something, but at least in those particular cases you have some degree of legal protection and certainty that money is going to come to you. But in the United States, other than in the state of Louisiana, your parents can otherwise disown you at any time, or any family member can disown anybody and is not obligated to leave you with anything. So in that particular context, we always just want to be really mindful that as a baseline, when it comes to inheritance, we can in certain cases have higher probability of receiving something. In other cases, we have no guarantee that that's going to happen.
Sure. Well, and even in a lot of instances, people are living a long time these days. I think a lot of times they spend through their money, even if they intended to leave some to their children. End of life care is insanely expensive.
Yeah, I mean, 3 out of 4 people in the United States are going to need some sort of assistance before they die, whether that's a brief home hospice stay, whether that is a long-term care full memory unit, whether that's just sort of adult daycare assisted living. Like, there's many different gradients of this, but a lot of these things will cost tens of thousands of dollars a month, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And so, in those contexts, right, it's very easy to sort of burn through your wealth very quickly at the end of your life based on just your cost of care and your needs, let alone then if you wanted to leave gifts to people or do any donations and philanthropy or anything else that takes money out of the estate.
Right. Okay, so let's say that you do get this inheritance or a lump sum. How do you know at what point you need to hire a financial planner then? Some people maybe aren't what they would consider themselves to be high earners, but they get a big lump sum one time. Is that something you can manage on your own and kind of figure out, or you should hire a professional?
I'd really encourage hiring a professional if it's a meaningful amount of money. If you inherit like $5,000 or something, that might be a lot of money to you, but it's not such an amount of money that warrants professional help. But let's say you're a household earning somewhere between 100,000, 200,000, and you inherit, let's just say, $1 million. Okay, well, at that point, it would make sense to hire a financial planner, not just to like invest it or manage the money or something like that, but just because we tend to mentally account for inheritance very differently. than we do for our earned income or our own savings. And so it's not uncommon for people to treat windfalls as sort of easily spendable in a way that their own fungible income would not otherwise be treated, where people will say like, whoa, if I ever inherited money, I know what car I'm going to buy and I'm going to pay off my mortgage. I'm going to take a big trip here or there. And suddenly like half the inheritance is just gone. And it's not to say that that's immediately a bad thing, because maybe that's what's right for you, or you're in the right place in life for it, or it's what the person leaving you the money would have wanted you to do. But it's very, very easy to spend a giant chunk of change in a hurry if we're not very careful. And that really can cause problems with kind of our next topic along the line, which we'll get to at some point, which is lifestyle creep. If you absorb this finite resource into your average quality of life and don't have a way to backfill it or replace it at some point, it really could cause quite a few problems just in your financial future to expand your overall quality of life and cost of living based on a finite temporary resource.
Sure. Well, so then it comes down to the advice that you would give someone. And of course, it's very, very, very situation specific. But what kind of things do people need to consider when they're figuring out what to do with this inheritance? Do I buy a house or do I save it all, or some hybrid version of these million choices I have?
Yeah, I think it's okay to think about it in terms of trying to pre-fund certain things. So, let's say you're in your 30s or 40s and you inherit this meaningful amount of money. Were you saving for your kids' college? Can we maybe save ourselves money in the long run by pre-funding some of that, by putting, enough of a lump sum into their 529 that now we no longer need to do any month-to-month saving? Can we pre-fund our next car, or next big trip, our next vacation, that vacation home? Can we make some meaningful investments that help us accelerate our financial independence such that we're going to be in a position to retire earlier or make different career decisions earlier? I think that's a lot more meaningful than just the I'm going to go buy a Lexus now because I can sort of consumption decisions. And if the sum of the lump of sum of money is big enough, there's a world in which you can probably spend some of it a little bit more frivolously. But just generally speaking, I'm inclined to tell people to be a little bit more conscientious about how they utilize an inheritance than just suddenly treating it like they want a small lottery ticket.
So if you're going to celebrate, maybe go out for dinner or something, but don't necessarily treat yourself in a big way.
Well, and I think it's just proportional, right? Like if your inheritance was $100,000, it's okay to maybe take a vacation with $5,000, $10,000 of it and then deploy the rest in a meaningful way. But, at the same time, if your inheritance was $2 million, then maybe buying that Porsche makes more sense for you. It's just a question of proportionality. But if it's not enough to support the behaviors it leads to, so take, maybe I inherited $250,000, so I buy that Porsche. Well, you can afford the Porsche, but now you've increased your auto insurance costs substantially. You've increased your maintenance and upkeep costs in your vehicle substantially. You increased the cost of your gas because now you need a type of premium gas substantially. And that's not, the type of expense that your normal cash flow was built to support, because it wasn't within your means in the first place in that hypothetical. And so that's the thing to be very conscious of, is that lifestyle creep can be very dangerous when inheritance is the triggering event, in that it's not just about the one-time consumption decision, it's about what it does to you in a subsequent lifestyle sense.
Right. Which I think we need to jump into. We keep kind of dancing around it, but this lifestyle creep thing that we're talking about, I think has a much larger impact on your overall finances, both now and long term, that I think people realize, because it's so easy to kind of increase your lifestyle little bits at a time, especially if you get a big raise. I don't know if you have anything to add around that, other than it's just so important to keep track of, because I see it happen all the time.
Yeah, it's a really dangerous one, because, when we talk about financial planning and retirement planning and so on, we sort of have a joke, which is anybody in America can retire at any time. It's just a question of quality of living. And so in that particular sense, right, if your lifestyle creep really takes off, that can be a problem. But there's a phenomenal example, which is the source of this is from some writings by Nick Maggioli, and I've played with the numbers quite a bit. The basic thing here is when you start your career somewhere, you go to graduate high school, graduate college, whatever, and you get your first like real adult job, the thing you're going to actually pay all your bills with and live off of. You do or do not have a retirement savings plan. And assuming that you do, you pick a savings rate that's probably just going to be based on the matching rate because you're still young and you make more money than you've ever made. And also it's not very much money, just in most professions. Your first entry level job is okay, but not great. And in that particular sense, the problem that then emerges is often as you advance in your career, as you get promotions, as you get raises and so on, your quality of life expands with those raises and promotions, but your savings rate may not pick up in a meaningful sense. And the key here is you might say, well, okay, maybe I'm saving 10%, in my first job, and then when I take my new job and I get a $20,000 raise, I keep saving 10%. So surely I'm expanding my savings, appropriately by doing that. Yes, but. And the but here is that if your lifestyle is also expanding, then in your previous career stages when you couldn't afford to save more, or you were only saving at a certain percentage of your income at that time, which then is a reflection of your expenses at that time, you have also undersaved historically in your earliest savings years, which are also your best savings years as far as compounding returns. And so what can happen there is, functionally, to really make up the difference in lifestyle creep that can occur through raises and promotions, you need to be saving something like 50% of the raise. If you go from, let's say, 50,000 to 70,000, you should be increasing your long-term savings by about $10,000 in that scenario, as opposed to, let's say, 10% where you were saving 5,000 before and now you're saving 7,000 before. You're under saving by about $8,000 in that scenario. And that issue only compounds further as your career expands and grows and you get into the six figures and so on.
Sure. And it has a huge impact. I think a lot of people just don't think it through because, like you said, they think that certain percentage rate is enough. I know growing up, my mom said always put 10% of your check into your savings account, and that's good advice. And it was at that time. I was a high schooler, but I don't think for quite some time after that I thought about increasing it when I should have. When I was, I think, in my early 20s, I don't think I did.
I mean, heck, you got a promotion last year. Did you take 50% of your promotion and put it in your 401k?
No, but I'm trying to buy a house. I have different, not straight into 401k.
You are at least saving that difference, though.
Yes. Yeah. My high yield savings account is looking better. But
there you go.
That's specific to me. Yeah. I don't know if I'll ever afford one here in Boulder County where we live, but that is the dream. Which actually, okay, so on that topic, lifestyle creep, we've kind of been talking about just your overall lifestyle here in general. But what about one-off things? Like, okay, let's say someone's having an expensive wedding or they want to buy this one big item. And with lifestyle creep, they're like, well, I can afford to buy more of these big one-off items, but my day-to-day, I feel like isn't changing. Is that more or less something we need to worry about?
Yeah, the irony is the one-off items are often less of a problem than the baseline items. So the common example that people bring up is like the latte effect. If you didn't spend $5 on a latte Monday through Friday, you'd have X million dollars by the time you retired. And that's technically true, but it would save you a lot more than $25 a week. It would be paying, let's say, $500 or $1,000 less on your house, right? Having that much smaller of a mortgage. So, when it comes to baseline things versus one-offs, there are definitely responsible and irresponsible levels of spending on one-offs. I spent $108,000 on my wedding and related activities. So I know something about that. But in extension from that, there's still the balance of saying, look, your one-off expense on your wedding or the car or whatever it is much less meaningful than your recurring non-negotiable expenses. How expensive is your house? How many subscriptions do you have? How much insurance do you need, etc.? Those are kind of bigger issues. Even just comparing jobs, right? One job has a better salary and worse benefits. One has better benefits and a worse salary. Well, if you're in your 20s, the worse benefits probably aren't as big of a deal because insurance is cheaper for you. But if you're in your 50s, those benefits are really, really important. So there's just a balancing act where you have to look at it and say one-off events can be destructive and they can be completely harmless, but your baseline cost of living is really, really hard to adjust. It's one of the things where when we talk to new clients and they bring up, we're not really sure where our money goes, we often just look at what their baseline checking savings balance is. Do they have $2,000 in there, or do they have $50,000 in there? Because that often hints at a different type of money management. But when somebody is in that $2,000 camp, that really indicates that they, if they have it, they'll spend it. And so then you have to really focus on automating positive behaviors and taking decisions out of their hands.
Right. Which is why we always kind of, at least here with clients, we're always trying to have those automated saving things set up. It goes straight to your high yield savings, straight to your 401k, from your paycheck. Then you don't have to think about it. And whatever's left, you can spend guilt free.
Yeah. I mean, we brought on a client a little over a year ago, and I think they've turned on and turned off their monthly savings like 4 times in the last year. Because even though we're trying to automate it, they're still thinking about it every pay period or every month and thinking about it as a conscious consumption decision or savings decision. And that's problematic because every time they keep turning it off, they are hurting their long-term financial safety and health out of sort of an insecurity about their cash flow because they can afford to save it. They just kind of get scared about how much is in their checking and savings and they feel uncomfortable about it. But when you just make it a default thing that, look, 10% of my paycheck goes in that account and 5% goes into this account and so on, and you just live with what's left, it makes a really big difference. It's when you have to consciously decide, okay, and now I'm going to make this transfer that can sort of either become a inefficient thing where sometimes you just forget. And in other cases, it can become a problem where maybe you don't forget, but you do run into a problem with your ability to, make those conscious positive behavior decisions, right? It's like resisting the ice cream sundae. Like every individual ice cream sundae is not a problem. It's the ice cream sundae you just can't help but eat every other day that becomes a much bigger issue.
Yeah. I mean, I have to automate all of my savings, and I don't think I'm a very irresponsible person, but it's just so much easier. And I like to do that buckets thing, how like in your savings account, like high yield savings where I have mine, you can have all those different, like, this is my emergency fund, this is my tiny little house down payment fund, and that helps me to visualize and definitely motivates me. I mean, I'm a list person. I like checking things off lists, and it lets you put the goal in, like, my emergency fund goal is this much. Very satisfying for people out there who like lists. You got to do the bucket thing. I'm saving more than ever.
Well, and it's very helpful to do that. I mean, I'll say I'm also a bad role model for this in that I do all the responsible things. I save like crazy, but I still do it manually on a going basis, other than like 401k. And it's the same thing as who I am as like a business owner. Like I still do my own bookkeeping. And that's because on some level, I like sort of the ritual of looking at it. Not like in an insecurity sense, but I like looking at it and evaluating it and understanding what's happening there. I like staying attached to it and being informed about where everything is. And I know consciously that that's not an efficient use of my time as a business owner. And I know that on an individual level that I'm going to transfer the same amounts of money anyway. But I like keeping track of it. It's sort of a meaningful activity to me. But I don't recommend that for most people because A, most people aren't good at it, and B, it's not a good use of anybody's time, mine included.
Do you think you'll always be that way, or do you intend to try and change that in the future?
I will have to give up bookkeeping at some point because as the practice grows, right, there's only going to be that many more transactions and things that go on and so on. But by extension from that, something like personal transfers and savings, like I took a baby step today. I set up an automatic investment of my monthly HSA contribution instead of just the automatic contribution to the account and manually trading it, because I was like, I am actually truly genuinely only doing the exact same thing every month. So like this is actually automatable, and my looking at it is doing nothing, because I also often forget about like a day or two, or like I'll put the money in on the first day of the month and then I'll remember a day or two later, like, oh shit, I didn't put money in my HSA, or like I didn't like invest the money in my HSA. I got to do that. It's like that's a good example where automation is necessary because it's keeping me from getting distracted, but I'm still mindful of like how much it goes into my my household joint savings versus individual savings and so on every period.
So that's on record that you're going to start delegating more in the future. That's interesting. That was kind of my takeaway there.
Congratulations, Emily.
I get to invest your personal HSA. That's very exciting. One other topic is like, nah, that's not that interesting to me. You're not paying me enough for that.
Au contraire. I see how it is.
It's public record. Now everyone's going to go look it up. So as we're talking about lists of the creepier, the last little bit is, okay, we've talked about budgeting, I think, a little bit in the podcast, but still, every time I do it with a client or anyone in my personal life who continually asks me about budgeting, are forever surprised by how much they actually spend on stuff. And I am too. When I'm okay, so this is a thing I'm bad at. I actually don't have a budget. I just spend whatever I want because I do all the saving stuff first. But then I feel really stressed out when I buy like an expensive gravel bike recently. So I should probably make a budget. But is that something you think everyone really needs to do as long as they're doing those saving methods first, or not necessarily?
I think it comes back to whether you're the $2,000 in your checking or $50,000 in your checking type of people. And I say that because, I think negative budgeting, which is where you just do all the savings and you just say, I can spend all the money I have because I've already done all the responsible things. I think that's much easier in practice. I think that's challenging than if you are the type of person to accidentally overspend on like a credit card versus a debit card. That's sort of a responsibility thing where you still have to have a healthy sense of like what you can really afford to spend in any given kind of between paychecks sort of way. But if you're the type of person who ends up in the $2,000 in checking camp, having meaningful budget categories is sort of important, but I don't think it's actually enough to have those. I think you need a tool like Monarch Money, or you need a budget, YNAB, or Mint back in the day, but something that actually will tell you, hey, you have now overspent, or you've gotten very close to your limit on dining out, or you've gotten very close to your limit on groceries, you're very close to your limit on video games, like whatever it is, some sort of tool that will nudge you not to overspend in that category. Because otherwise, it's just this fungible pool of money. You go like, well, yeah, maybe I've overspent a little bit on dining out this week, but I'll just make up the difference by not going to the movies later, or I'll delay until my next paycheck to buy those concert tickets or whatever it is. And I think it's helpful to have a tool that will just call it out if you're the type who has a hard time actually building up a cash position.
Okay, all right, I can work with that. Here comes my smooth transition to the third topic that's not really related to the other two.
When I was in duo in high school doing speech and debate, there was a team that whenever they changed scenes in their bits, they would go, "This is transitional material." Yeah. So that's what I'm envisioning as you do this.
All right, we'll have to start editing that into the podcast because our third topic is leadership qualities. And okay, to give a little bit of context for listeners, because this is kind of out of left field, I've started going back to school. The whole long story, I guess I don't need to get into that. But one of the classes that I'm required to take now that I'm going again 10 years later is that I have to take this Applying Leadership Principles class, which originally I was very opposed to. I was like, surely I don't need to take this type of class again. Did all these when I was a freshman in college a million years ago. I'm not going to learn anything from this class. And I've actually really liked the class a little bit because it's a good refresher. It's not because the content is necessarily new, but it is good to have a refresher on these leadership things, especially as if I'm training new people at work or any other leadership roles I have in my personal life. So after all that, Dan, as a leader and boss of this company, do you have advice for other leaders?
Don't take advice from other leaders.
That can't be it, Dan.
Yeah, it's not, but like I'm always mindful. There's a book out there. It's like was written like in the 60s, but it's called "If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him," and it just makes the point that like nobody has all the answers. So in asking me like what advice do I have for other leaders, I'm just mindful that like my advice is only so useful as it's useful to your individual situation or your type of leadership or the type of organization you're in. So with that caveat out of the way, things that I would recommend or advise for the leaders, I think number one, you have to always sort of take this perspective or this philosophy that nobody makes mistakes intentionally. So it's easy as a leader to see a failure to complete a task or accomplish something as a deliberate form of malfeasance. Like, oh, I told my team to do something and they didn't do it. They're screwing off. They're doing this wrong, and it's a character flaw. But like most people want to do a good job. Most people want to succeed and nobody really wants to get yelled at. And so in that context, I think it's always important to sort of look at the mistakes your team makes as things that you're fundamentally responsible for. If your team doesn't do the right thing, you failed to make clear your objectives, you failed to train them appropriately, you failed to take responsibility for the outcomes of your team. And I think that's where the fundamental rule of leadership comes in. And very succinctly, good leadership is giving your team the credit when they succeed, and good leadership is taking the blame when they fail. Because ultimately what your team does or does not accomplish is your responsibility. That's what being a leader is.
Very good advice, but kind of a tough pill to swallow for some people. I don't think everyone would be maybe capable of doing that.
I think it's challenging in a particular regard, particularly because we're all sort of self-interested creatures, right? So like we've all heard of or experienced the case where like a boss just like throws you under the bus, where they're just like, oh yeah, it didn't get done. Emily really dropped the ball and didn't get this done. And you as Emily, it could be true, right? It could be that you genuinely didn't get this thing done for whatever reason. But this comes back to the leadership being a form of ownership. Why didn't you? Did I give you too much to do? Did I not give you the tools to succeed? Did I not train you? Did I not communicate in a timely manner? Did you not have the resources to accomplish this? And so it might be literally true that you didn't do something, but it's also just as true and valid and potentially even more important that if the team is not succeeding at something, that is a leadership failing. I got into an argument with a client years ago, kind of in a year after COVID, in which I did a blog post. You can still look it up to this day. I think it was called Fair Wages for Fair Work or something like that. It was just talking about the process of getting raises. It was talking about how, like, look, every year that you work at a company or at a business or in an organization, they at the very least owe you an inflation adjustment, because you've been there for a year, you have that much more experience, you made that many more contributions, and because of inflation, the purchasing power of your salary or your wages has gone down. And that is not your fault as a worker. It's not even the fault of the business owner, but it's a reality that if you're making $100,000 a year in a position in year one, and next year you don't get a raise, then the next year you're making less. The dollar amount didn't change, but the purchasing power decreased. And that makes no sense in an organization where you are a person now who has that much more experience and tenure and presumably more efficient and effective than you were on day one. And so the part where this argument came up with this client is they were very mad when I sort of just said, like, look, if your employer's not giving you raises and so on, not necessarily promotions, but if they're not at least giving you inflation adjustments, that's a failure of leadership. And this business owner got very upset because he was like, look, I'm the first in and the last out, and I changed the toilet paper in the bathrooms, and throughout all of COVID, I never had to fire somebody, and I made personal financial sacrifices to keep people hired and employed, but I couldn't give raises, and like, you're wrong, and it's bad of you to say this. And it's like, look, COVID was a crazy time, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but no individual person in your shop or your factory or your store or your restaurant is responsible for the financial capabilities of the business to pay fair compensation to the people in the business. And so if you are the leader who's responsible for the sales, or responsible for the delivery, or responsible for controlling costs, whatever it is, and you tell me that you can't give raises this year because there's not enough revenue to support it, that is a failure of your leadership. And again, there can be a lot of external factors. We have tariff things going on right now. There can be tax issues. There can be, regulatory problems. There can be market cycle problems. There's a million things that can impact this, but the leader is responsible for the outcome. And so that was sort of the argument that I made at the time. And that's where I come back to this. Everything your team does successfully, they get credit for. Everything that goes wrong is your fault. That is always true. There are no exceptions.
Wow. Well, I like that. That's a good note to wrap it up on, actually. I don't think I even want to add to that.
Oh, see, now we're on a roll. We can have a whole leadership afternoon, Emily. Let's get into organizational theory and all this fun stuff.
I have to bite my tongue sometimes too, though. The one public policy meeting I went to with you, I think we all learned how that went. So
it went just fine.
I love sharing my opinions in public.
I will say one more thing on this, though. So take that same rule and then apply it to individuals on your team. Everyone has to contribute, and everybody has to put forth a genuine effort. And when you make exceptions, that is always going to result in some version of heartburn, whether that's because somebody else on the team is picking up the slack for that person that's not contributing, whether that causes somebody to leave because they're frustrated with what feels like an inequitable division of labor or compensation, whatever it is. Again, you own the failures and you give credit for the successes, but that also gives you permission to say that what I need to do as a leader sometimes is remove somebody or go through addition by subtraction. So it's not to say that I'm encouraging you to just start firing everybody on your team that you don't like or whoever is late to a meeting or something, but I will just throw that out as one other maxim of leadership, is that your team sees you and how you show up and how you contribute, but they also see how the others do. And you should never have a team in which somebody looks at somebody else on the team and goes, Joe over there is the weak link, and we'd all be better off without Joe. If you're ever getting to that point, then as a leader, you have a responsibility to either set Joe up to succeed and get out of that sort of pit, or to remove Joe from the equation.
What if it's an opposite situation where it's not one team member is viewed as, being much lower, less helpful, but the opposite where maybe there's a favorite? Do you approach that the same way?
Favorite in that everybody knows that person is just the best, or favorite as in like you as a manager are just sort of affectionate for this particular employee and just sort of show them favoritism?
Second one.
See, and then that's just toxic leadership. because everybody in your team should be respected and honored for their contributions in their own ways, recognizing that different people in the team are going to be at different stages in their career and their tenure with the organization and so on, right? Like you were the first hire in the team that we have today. You have technically the most seniority, so you have the most context, the most history, and so on. And I like you as an individual. But you also still have a lot to learn as a financial planner in both the practice on the technical side and the art and so on and so forth. In turn, Daniel has more industry experience, but he's been on our team less time. And he comes at it from a very different type of industry experience where, even though he has ostensibly more planning experience, you both are uniquely and different contributors in certain ways. Olivia's the newest member of our team. Right. And so it's not fair of me to baby her as a new member, nor would it be fair of me to just give her a pass on anything for performance. Right. So consistency is also really key here. Like I can say, Emily, good job. But what it should never get to the point of is that everybody on the team goes, oh, Dan will let Emily get away with anything. Right. And on the same point, consistent feedback can be both positive and negative because people can't improve if you don't give them criticism around things that they validly need to hear. And in turn, people don't necessarily thrive on praise, but it's still important to give it when it's deserved.
Why don't you think people thrive on praise? I'm interested in that little tidbit.
Well, because praise is only so meaningful. Like there's a different type. You have like the whole thing of love languages. Oh, and that can sort of apply in a work context. Like I'm here for the money. I'm here for the prestige. I'm here for what I can learn. I'm here for the quality of life, the work-life balance, the culture, the mission. Like there's different reasons people are there. But praise doesn't pay your bills. Praise doesn't get you promotions. Praise doesn't, satisfy your base psychological needs beyond a certain level. And also recognize as a leader, my biggest fault is treating good behavior as the default assumption, right? My default setting is that everybody should be doing their job well. And so when you do your job well, I'm bad about praising it, which is why I have to make a deliberate effort to do so. But in turn, right, you have to also be able to give fair criticism when it's warranted. And so in that particular sense, again, like if ever there's just an obvious, like, well, Daniel's clearly the favorite here, then I've done something wrong in the balance of things. And in turn, right, if, Emily, you're just really not a contributor, right, then I've also failed to keep balance in things.
Sure. Well, lots to balance and think about as the boss, as the leader, I should say.
As some version thereof, the blind leading the blind and all that.
Our fearless leader.
I don't know about fearless.
Should we dig into that, or would you like to wrap it up? We can go a little longer.
I think that'll be a different podcast.
Come on, Dan. Okay, also next week's topics, or 2 weeks from now.
Of course. Dan's fears, what you can do to exploit them.
Oh, everyone would love that.
I'm sure people would be fascinated to start that podcast and really disappointed by the end of it. All right. Well, on that point, what have you learned in the last couple of weeks that you'd like to share with the audience?
It's going to be on a more personal note this time. I thought about it in advance. As I said earlier in this episode, actually, I'm a list person. And now that I've been back in school again and working and all that, I love working ahead and tend to burn out a little bit. And I haven't been. I've been trying to really structure it and do well and kind of, just be where I need to be and do really well and not work ahead like that. And it's going great, and I'm not overly stressed, and I'm still thoroughly enjoying my work and school and personal life. So actually, it does work. Who would have thought?
Yeah, it turns out not running until you collapse treats you a lot better than just keeping a steady pace.
Yeah, it's not my personality type, but I'm working on it. So moderation, I guess, is the short summary answer. Be reasonable is my big takeaway.
Fair enough. I think as the expression goes, everything in moderation, including moderation.
Exactly.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.